It's a new era in Brooklyn. Gone are the days of trade requests and quotes in the media. Gone are the days of Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, and James Harden. And now, the Nets are back to being a fun, budding team in the East, headlined by their blossoming wing star Mikal Bridges and a litany of wings ready to make some noise in the East. How much noise can they exactly make, though? Can this team get back to the playoffs? But first, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel for more NBA content. The season is almost here, and we have tons of great NBA videos coming your way to get you prepped for what should be an awesome season. It was a whirlwind of a season for the Nets last year. A Kevin Durant trade request, followed by a Kyrie Irving trade request, followed by Ben Simmons being the shell of himself. It's safe to say what could have went wrong in Brooklyn. And admittedly, the whole KD Kyrie era was like that. It was less about the games and what happened on the court than what happened off of it. But at least now, there's a new wave of guys to be excited about in Brooklyn. The KD and Kyrie trade helps the Nets reset their future, centered around Mikal Bridges, Nick Claxton, and a litany of other useful role players like Cam Johnson, Spencer Dinwiddie, Dorian Finney-Smith, Royce O'Neal, and dare I say the former All-Star Simmons. Ultimately, the post-All-Star break version of the Nets looked completely different. They weren't as top-heavy as they were with KD and Kyrie, but they posed an interesting new threat to Eastern Conference teams. One that was predicated off of a switch-heavy defense propelled by their abundance of versatile wings, and an offense that centered around the growing repertoire of Bridges. Bridges and crew played in the final 27 games of the season for Brooklyn. They went 12-15 in those games as they stumbled their way into the 2023 playoffs, only to be swept by the Philadelphia 76ers. Now, ultimately, the second half of last season didn't indicate much for Brooklyn, who was still trying to find their identity post-KD and Kyrie. But one thing became evident: Bridges has star potential on this team. In those 27 games, Bridges averaged 26 points on 48, 38, 90 shooting splits, being the primary offensive hub for the first time in his career. Now, many will ask if that's sustainable, and I think given his shot diet while in Brooklyn, it is. The Nets ran actions for Bridges that were really similar to those that were ran for him in Phoenix, with him curling to the basket or getting open mid-range shots off of cross screens. And while he expanded his off-the-bounce game more in Brooklyn, he was pretty successful in doing so. He doubled his pull-up shooting attempts from 4.6 to 9.2 and also jumped in efficiency, shooting 43% pre-All-Star break in Phoenix and 48% post-All-Star break in Brooklyn. Am I expecting him to be that efficient as a pull-up shooter this season? Probably not, but I think at some level, some of the creation stuff is sustainable from Bridges. Ultimately, he's probably punching above his weight a little bit as the #1 option this season for Brooklyn, but the added usage and the offense being funneled through him is going to make him a favorite for most improved and a guy that will be hard not to add to any All-Star team this season. What that looks like long-term, and if the Nets decide to build around him long-term, just depends on how this looks. But I think Brooklyn is going to take a patient approach, especially when they know Bridges has a lot of suitors should they ever decide to explore a trade. And realistically, the defensive side of the ball is where Bridges makes his bread. He is versatile on that end. His length allows him to be a menace both on and off the ball, and around him and big man Nick Claxton, Brooklyn's defensive identity is clear: switch everything. Claxton was super impressive last season for Brooklyn as a switch big, being able to venture out onto the perimeter and guard quicker players. And he would also serve as an elite rim protector on the inside. Add guys like Dorian Finney-Smith and Royce O'Neal into the mix, and head coach Jacques Vaughn has a lot of defensive tools that he can work with. Not to mention, the Nets extended Cam Johnson this summer to a 4-year deal that could be worth up to $108 million, who's also another rangy wing who can defend multiple positions and shoot. With Bridges, Claxton, Finney-Smith, O'Neal, and now Johnson, the Nets can put out a really tough defensive group. And at the guard spot, while Dinwiddie isn't necessarily an elite defender by any means, he is big and he can switch out onto the perimeter and adhere to their scheme. Besides, the Nets also added Dennis Smith Jr. this summer, who sort of had a breakout year, at least defensively, in Charlotte, showing off his versatility on that end, especially at the point of attack. It remains to be seen how much Smith Jr. can grow on the offensive end, but pre-injuries, he was an offensive-minded player, and he's recently shaped his game into one more focused on the defensive side of the ball. And I think that only makes the Nets defense even better this upcoming season. I wouldn't be surprised if this Nets team is a top 10 defense this year because of their nucleus and the evident scheme that they can play. Now, the one elephant in the room for the Nets this season is going to be Simmons. He is the ultimate X factor for what happens to this team and their potential ceiling. At his best, we've seen Simmons be a top 25 player in this league who can get downhill with the best of them. And he is also, or was, one of the best defenders in the NBA. But Simmons hasn't been that in a while. He hasn't played more than 60 games since his third season in the league. He missed half of last year dealing with a back issue and looked like a shell of himself. His fit next to Claxton because of the spacing issues has been wonky, and ultimately because he was injured, he never really got a fair crack at playing with this new iteration of the team. It's unlikely that Simmons will ever get back to his all-star form, but can he somehow carve out a sustainable role for himself, both on the Nets and for the rest of his career? Maybe. There were moments last year where his vision and his passing was still potent, where he showed his ability to still defend at a high level. He's still a big body with a great feel for the game despite his clear scoring limitations, so maybe there is a world where he can morph into a different version of himself. Look, I'm not going to go out on a limb and say I expect a bounce back season from Simmons, but I do think he should be given the benefit of the doubt because of the back issues he's dealt with over the last couple of years. Whether he is healthy enough to play this year and play at a high level, that remains to be seen, but it also makes for one awesome story. And ultimately, there isn't an immense amount of pressure on Simmons to be anything major for this Nets team. Yes, if he gets back to playing consistent, positive basketball, he changes their ceiling, but the team isn't relying on him to do that necessarily. Their future is predicated on Bridges, Claxton, Johnson, and some of their other young players that they hope can break through on this new look Nets squad. Arguably, the most intriguing is Cam Thomas, who has had moments where he's looked like one of the best young scorers the league has to offer, but clearly needs to work on his shot selection and defense. If Cam can somehow be reined in, if he can use his powers for good rather than evil, for a lack of better phrasing, maybe he's the player who can change their ceiling. Right now, he's going to be a microwave scorer off of the bench for this team, but if he can become a better, more consistent shooter and maybe develop a playmaking game and just improve his overall feel, it'd be huge for his career. They also have Day'Ron Sharpe, who was their backup big man for the majority last season. Sharpe is a pretty limited offensive player, but ultimately he's a rim runner, rebounder, and a guy who can maybe protect the rim for them off of the bench. The big man position is arguably the hardest learning curve for young players, so it'll take some time for him to get acclimated, but maybe he can be more consistent for them this season. In the 2023 draft, they took swings on big man Noah Clowney and wing Dariq Whitehead, who both have tons of potential. Clowney offers much of the same that Sharpe does, as a rim running big with a high feel for the game. He's a good rebounder, plays with a high motor, and ultimately, it'll be interesting to see how much he can add offensively, especially in the shooting department. But I think he'll be battling in year one with Sharpe for that backup center spot. Whitehead is an even more tantalizing prospect for the Nets. He struggled dealing with injuries and a Jones fracture in his foot in his one season at Duke, but ultimately, there's no question what he can be if he's healthy. He's a great shooter with an incredible first step and has unreal athleticism to match. He still needs to work on his overall feel for the game, especially as a playmaker, but his skill set screams out all-star level potential if he can ever put it all together and stay healthy. Ultimately, Clowney has a better chance of actually cracking the Nets rotation this season, but I wouldn't be surprised if we're talking about Whitehead in the next couple of years as a major breakout candidate. To round out their offseason additions, the Nets also added Lonnie Walker, Darius Bazley, Harry Giles, Trendon Watford, Jordan Hall, Kiefer Sykes, and Armani Brooks. Now, most of these guys are going to be fighting for the final roster spots, ultimately, but Walker is going to be a rotation guy for this team immediately. He was awesome for the Lakers last season, especially in the playoffs where he had a couple of big games and moments against the Warriors in round 2. He's an explosive guard who can score off of the ball and create a little bit, and because of his athleticism, he can hold his own defensively. Ultimately, the Nets' 8 to 10 man rotation will consist of the starters in Claxton, Finney Smith, Cam Johnson, Bridges, and Dinwiddie, and their bench guys in O'Neal, Simmons, Walker, Dennis Smith, Cam Thomas, and either one of Sharpe or Clowney as the big. Regardless, Coach Vaughn has a lot of tools at his disposal to make a unique team, one that could pose an interesting threat in the Eastern Conference. Brooklyn is projected at 37.5 wins, and it's sort of hard to tell if that's too high or too low. They were a below 500 team after all of the trades that they made, and I ultimately think both him and the rest of the squad will have to take take their developmental bumps as they adjust to a new reality. That being said, I think I'd go under, but just barely, and it wouldn't surprise me if they go over, but also just barely. Ultimately, this team is going to be, at best, a play-in team in the Eastern Conference, with Boston, Milwaukee, Cleveland, Philadelphia, New York, Atlanta, and even Indiana fielding more talent on their rosters. And I think that's okay, because this phase for the Nets is one of transition, and this season is sort of a test run to see what this team can be and what they'll need to be to improve and get to the next level. They have a lot of interesting pieces between Bridges, Claxton, and some of their younger prospects. They have tons of picks, not their own, but others, loaded for whenever they want to make a big splash trade. And above all else, good vibes are back in BK, at least for now. But do they make the playoffs? Let us know in the comments, and as always, make sure to like and subscribe to our channel. We'll see you guys later.